that, Mr. Subra.
Yeah. Good afternoon. For all of you who stayed back, thank you very much. And for all of you who spent the last 3 days here, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to meet many of you, some of you more than others. But this is the chance for me to sort of summarize. I won't say I've summarized everyone's speeches, but rather we tried to throw in our own insights, to throw in some view on the highlights of the year that's gone by, and sort of a peek at what we might think are key or important issues that will drive the road ahead. I mean, I think for those of you who still have to go and catch a flight, I can summarize for you very quickly that this year was a year where the early year Bangladesh and Sri Lanka demand was joined by Malaysia, Indonesia and the Philippines, and up till about July, August, the market's been very much caught up with the Asian demand. Not that Africa wasn't buying, Africa was also buying, but they had, with Asia having the attention of Thailand and Vietnam, the cheaper or more competitive prices came from other markets in Pakistan, from Myanmar, as well as from India, who are dominant. Fast forward to today, we're starting to see arrivals. Some of the big harvests are going to be underway in Thailand, India, Cambodia, Pakistan, Myanmar. So you have a lot of rice that's making its way into markets. So you get that little depressed feeling. But with next week's NFA tender, there's something very interesting to look out for, with up to 750,000 tons of purchases online. This could be the short-term activity that captures the market's view and options. So what do we look at beyond that? We have elections in Bangladesh at the end of the year. We have elections in Nigeria. We have elections in India. We have elections in Indonesia. We even have some kind of elections in the Philippines. So there's a lot of politics. And for those of you who know me, I can tell you my last slide always tells you rice market is very easy if you understand the weather and politics. But those are two of the most difficult things to understand. So what we try to do is try to maintain a database of numbers, price ideas that will help guide us to future decisions, or at least learn from past what activities can keep markets and what activities cool. So one of the other big items on the future would be Thailand's crop. Last year, Thailand's Homali crop, or you say the northeastern area, performed weaker than expected, and that created a very strong push for Thai prices. We saw $1,200 Homali prices. They've come down a little bit since, and now we are starting to see people offer two different prices for an older variety and a current crop variety. And the initial indication is that the crop will be normal, and normal, you don't know much until you're closer to November or even December when you actually see the actual arrivals. But so what we feel is that there's going to be a small time of pressure in Homali markets, and this is where you might see what Thailand does relative to Vietnam or Cambodia and how the competitive situation develops. Vietnam itself is also a very big producer of fragrant rice. This year we saw DT8 being introduced, and it's been widely used and shipped to Africa as well as to Iraq. So these are all new items on the menu. You might say supply, and sometimes when I show you fragrant rice, it includes everything. It doesn't break down smaller. That's why we had Mr. Famdiu, Mr. Kwang, earlier on from Agro Monitor. He has the numbers that break it down. I use it when I want to tell a story sometimes. Okay, so. Okay, first of all, I want to say thanks to all the sponsors. We spent a lot of time organizing these events, and while I know that Jeremy has already said thank you at the beginning, my chance to say it at the end. You know, the big sponsors, Phoenix has been very kind to support us last 2 years as platinum sponsors. Bigger sponsors from Beulah, who's been with us a long time. Vina Food has been a sponsor every year, but when it came to their home turf, they decided to take up the gold sponsorship. You know, so I can't say all the names, so I thought I'll show it to you on the screen and give each and every company credit. We had a number of Vietnamese exporters exhibit here, from organic rice to fragrant rice, to even glutinous rice from Laos we had here. So these sponsors make this event work, because otherwise having a nice fancy hotel like this, cost can be a bit of an issue. And you know, we try to appreciate all the help, whether you're a delegate, sponsor, or just a simple supporter. Okay. The key markets in focus is, well, I told you earlier on, it started with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. then Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. So I don't think we need to go too much into that. We did see a very strong bullock element, and because of the rains in Thailand or the shortage of resources at ports, the shipments were dragged on later until September, if I'm not wrong. What I didn't tell you earlier on was African markets. They are stable, but they seem weaker. And I feel that sometimes they seem weaker because there is that presence of Chinese old crop, which has kind of taken the role of Thai old crop in the last few years. And you're also coming at a time, last year at this time, most of the traders were really happy because the euro was getting stronger and it was easy to make money at destination. Today, the situation is slightly different. Whatever you shipped in the beginning of the year is probably FOB level priced higher than what you are buying at source today. So the inventory that you're holding is at a higher cost or price than what you can buy, but you have to wait the 1 or 2 months to get. That's made things a little bit more challenging, and of course the strong dollar and a variety of other political or even you can call it trade war and its own consequences have left the market, I feel, a little bit in a state of adjustment. You can call it shell shock, but basically a lot of people are trying to adjust to what would be the new. I mean, as we arrived here, we walked into the hotel, first Pakistani delegate I met told me, did you see the Pakistan rupee? Just this week, it was devalued. I think it went down to as low as 136 before it climbed back to about 131, as I understand it. I haven't checked the latest. But these are all elements, the same thing we've seen. The Indian exporters will be telling me, the local prices have not really changed, but the exchange rate, the rupee, has become very weak. And this has actually allowed India to be way more competitive in the marketplace without actually doing too much in the domestic market. A lot of it is just exchange. In the same way, in Pakistan, the stocks are under the control of stockists and millers. So the situation in Pakistan is slightly different from India. When the devaluation came, the local prices were adjusted higher immediately. So you didn't really see too much of an FOB price action. So we also have the oil markets. Many of us were expecting Nigeria and its related markets, Benin, Cameroon, Niger, to demand for more palm oil rise, but didn't quite measure up. I think there are the usual spikes before Christmas and all happening, but the volumes are relatively sluggish up to now. Despite what you say, the local market prices are still quite high and very attractive for imports. Middle East markets have shown some weakness, mainly because of the Iran and the sanctions that start in November, really. It's going to open the door to whether India is going to continue the older way of trading for oil and rice that they used to. How the new business, you know the stories out there about how contracts are not being fulfilled these days, and there's a lot of defaults, up to 200 million or something like that. I read in some newspaper article, but it's basically added new risk to the marketplace. We've also heard that the Iranian buyers were in Thailand about a month ago negotiating contracts. No one can really tell how much of those contracts will turn out to be real, but when we start seeing it in the shipping data, then we'll start to understand what happened. The same thing we saw previously from Mexico. Okay, let's look at India. The key points there, they have a raised MSP, minimum support price. Based on our calculation some time back, it was equivalent to $30 per ton. I don't know how that's going to spread within the market, but this goes to the farmer. But the purchases, the local market purchases will start from November and peak. That's going to add somewhat of a floor to Indian markets, while most of its movement over the last few years has really been a reflection of the Indian rupee. The Indian rupee has been very weak, and you might say that some exporters enjoy that weakness and the competitiveness that comes, and it also made business for exporters much more lucrative. Production is expected to be at a record level. We're always watching the estimates, and basically the acreage was higher. There's a lot of debate about actually what's going to be produced, but what we understand so far from the sources that we're talking to is that India's basmati rice production should be inching down about 2.5% or something like that, while the non-basmati side of it looks a little bit more prosperous. So if the total production is going to go higher, then we're going to start looking at the breakdown in terms of how much of it is white rice, the key markets that are close to the export ports, and things like that. Excuse me. India is also opening up to China. The first trial shipment is already underway, and when you talk to people, there's a sort of initial hope that 100,000 tons of exports to China, and most people suggest that it's likely to be broken rice. Seems to be the starting point. So India's possibilities with China would mean that India also joins the ranks of Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Pakistan as sellers to China. So that's news. Previously, they were only allowed to sell basmati rice to China. So there's a list of 19 or 15 companies that are now approved by the Chinese authorities to export. So we're going to have to follow that very closely. I believe that a couple of the people who are involved in those trades with China are here. So I'm sure there's no shortage of resources from India here. So looking at Pakistan, we feel that Pakistan's production is going to be steady to higher. We heard Fawad already kind of talk about plans to export more, which means they need to produce more as well. And the devil is in the detail. They've been very successful on the back of Europe's laws on trichosole and the residue issues that stopped Indian basmati rice from going there. So for the first time in our data, we saw that India's exports to Europe were actually higher than what they normally, Pakistan's exports to Europe were higher than what they normally, they export to Middle East. So this is a bit of a change. Normally Middle East is the biggest market for basmati rice. But this time, for Pakistan's case, this year they've sold more rice to European markets than to the Middle East. Whereas India's success in basmati rice has come from selling more basmati rice to the Middle East, while the European market share fell down. So with the Iran sanctions and everything else, there's actually quite a lot to grab for here. How it's going to shape up, currency aside, how's this trade? Is India going to ignore the US expectation of countries to play with these sanctions? In the past, India used to bypass the sanctions and have this system of selling basmati rice in exchange for oil, and they had a way of credits for that. Okay, Vietnam, I think we've gone into some details. The production looks steady. In fact, I'd say it's rising very slightly. But in Vietnam, the name of the game now is to understand what's been planted. The last few years has seen Vietnam grow considerably as a supplier to China. That situation is changing. Mr. Kwang already suggested that the border trades are about, 600 over 1,000 tons. It's actually an improvement this year over last year same time. But what he also said is like more of the border trades are glutinous rice, and less of it is the broken rice and low-grade rice that used to go before. So there's a change in the dynamics, and a lot of this has to do with China last year was open to, you don't need allocation for glutinous rice imports, you can pay the 5% duty and get through. Suddenly, fast forward to June, July, and you had a new policy that says that only broken rice and flour doesn't need allocation, and you get 5% duty, whereas all others are somewhere between 40 and 50%. This changed the demand. China's demand to us is softer, but what we are seeing is that they are still very interested in higher grade rice going across through formal channels, and they're facing up to this question of higher quota costs. The quotas cost more because there's more demand chasing after the paper. Now, the success for Vietnam comes from fragrant rice. I put it here as jasmine rice, but in all honesty, there's a variety of Vietnamese rice. I'm pretty sure Jeremy, when he goes through the contestants, would have seen quite a lot of varieties. I come across DTA, ST21, and many other varieties, and each one is really catered for different. So what we've seen, the success for Vietnam has been with African sales and Iraq. They have been going to the new DT8 variety, which seems to have provided a very good price point, and it comes at a very good time when Thai rice is also looking tight. So that's been a success story for Vietnam, whereas glutinous rice was very successful beginning half of the year, and suddenly it's kind of fallen off the charts, and it's picking up again now, but I don't think we're going to see volumes like we've seen in the past. So Vietnam has success with Africa, success with Iraq, but the China part of it is a concern. So that would be the nutshell that you're looking at. And there's also Japonica rice market, where I believe that the exports would have doubled this year compared to last year. South Korea, the Pacific Islands, Papua New Guinea, Australia, these are all the markets.
So if you don't mind adding, one thing I've said, but I just want to accentuate, and I know this will give Subra time to have a drink, and so it's not an excuse, but it's a reason. But in addition to that, I'm very concerned about the Vietnamese Japonica. I've showed my negativity about this market, but this happens in things where we all push for higher quality. But if you look at the Vietnamese Japonica rice, it went from a few 100,000 tons to 400,000 tons to 600,000 tons. There's about 1.1 million tons or more of exportable Japonica rice from Vietnam this year. And so I say that as extreme negative in the overall Japonica market. It's going to be flooded with material, and you're seeing it, combined also, and I'm sure Subra's going to get to it, with the Chinese. The Chinese are offering Japonica prices at almost half California prices, at like $320 for Chinese. And so you have this double punch of Viet and China on the Japonica market. If I'm a Japonica buyer, this is probably the best market I've ever seen, just because everybody had such great crops. But I think the Vietnamese are almost in a panic situation with their Japonica rice. It is that negative, with about 500,000 tons of who knows where it will go rice, because there is no market at all for that material. So hopefully that was a good break for Subra for a second. But.
So on the same token, Japonica prices we are seeing now in the low 500s to this year versus last year it was in the 600 or higher level from Vietnam. And there is a change in supply dynamics there. And also earlier this year, with Vietnam planting less 50404, when we had Malaysia, Philippines and Indonesia come to the market, you got some fairly instant price response. So Vietnamese prices have been trading at a premium to even Thai prices for most of the year, especially with the Southeast Asian buyers playing an active role there. This is not normal. Normally Thailand is sold at a premium, but in this particular case, because of the tighter supplies of certain types of rice that are in demand, Vietnam has changed that way. Now looking at Thailand very quickly, the markets are changing there. There's not much old crop like they used to have the last few years. So that's kind of somewhat been replaced now in markets by Chinese old crop. This is the cheap rice that's coming into the markets now. The Thai competitiveness has actually been a good driver. Thailand has actually seen more G2G success at the tenders in selling to Indonesia, even to Malaysia, than they have seen in recent years, and that's because Thai prices have been very competitive, especially against Vietnam. Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, I might say, these three origins are close in Southeast Asia, and they are able to actually ship quite effectively to markets like Philippines and Indonesia. So when these demand come, these are the first places they go to, although we have seen more in Pakistan and Indian rice also make it to markets like Philippines, Indonesia this year. So we're going to touch on that a little later. And Thailand has seen more white rice sales compared to parboiled rice sales, and this is a reflection of the last few years. There was a Bangladesh element, there was a Nigeria element, there was South Africa and Yemen, all driving parboiled rice markets, and suddenly when Bangladesh slowed down and Indonesia and Malaysia and Philippines came, there was more white rice demand, and so the way the supply was directed was also changing. So this year if you see, I think Thai parboiled rice export volumes are slightly lower, whereas white rice export volumes are much higher. So that's something that we're using. Myanmar, we see it as steady to higher. The weather looks quite decent. Myanmar's big challenge is to compete with Chinese old crop in African markets, while at the same time you have the border trades with China that are also important. I think some of this I will skip through very quickly. And Cambodia as well is very much a reflection of what you see in Thailand. Their export volumes are slightly lower, but their success really comes in fragrant rice market exports, whereas the white rice market is a bit slower this year. Now this, Jeremy already showed you. The fact that it's so close at the top, 2019, suggests that it's meant to be quite bullish. But the problem is, like, I'm actually going to tell you a slightly bearish story on the way. Ending stocks, same thing. I wanted to show you that China's stocks are rising. The rest of the world is falling. So in terms of inventory, we look at it. And it also somewhat explains that China can export that much of old crop as well. And it really is a small dent on the total. So it's a strategic decision. China has always been very smart with their policy in terms of a few years ago, China was very open to world trade and said that we can't possibly be self-reliant on everything. And today with the trade war in the background, you're hearing more about being self-sufficient, and probably some of these stocks will come in handy if the need arises. So it gives you a strategic point. In this case, China is selling old crop to, China is both a big exporter now as well as the largest importer. It still remains. I don't expect China to become smaller than Nigeria or the Philippines. It's going to continue being number one, but it's not going to be 5-6 million tons number one. It's going to be 4. And that's the difference that we're seeing. Now this is another one. I put this together for Jeremy, and what this really shows you is the ending stocks for rice actually looks pretty okay. China, you know the story. But the situation for wheat and corn is a little bit more alarming because there's a sudden dip, a drop in inventory of other grains. So there's also a global grain market situation that needs to be considered as you go forward. And again, with the current climate of uncertainty and trade war and all that talk, the type of relationships you have with the suppliers is going to be very important, where you get your resources from. Consumption growth, I wanted to show you that I don't think we're going to see consumption grow forever. It's actually coming down over long term. But what's interesting is that if you take a closer look, almost all the consumption growth is actually coming from markets in Middle East and Africa. I had that chart, but I'll spare you. This is something that we do. There are 17 markets that we at TRT follow. Every month we try to update the data in terms of how much we have from them, where they're buying it from. So this includes China exports to some of these markets. We have our ways to find out through either receiving side customs document or exporting side customs document and try to put an idea in. Basically, the story I want to share here is that Africa is trending towards a lower 2018. And I'll show you a USDA number that actually shows Africa to have a record level for this year. And I think that's also a reflection of how the world politics or the world economic situation has changed this year, and it's led to a much more cautious trading environment. Yeah. So what's very important there is, like, from this, most of the numbers there are in red, which means year to year, that same period from January to July. This is when I last updated this number. I should be doing the September one soon for Jeremy, but we don't get September data till October or November, so it takes a bit of time. So these are actual official numbers that we have. We constantly look at them and to try and get an idea in terms of where they're going. So right now, Africa is buying 13% less. That's about 900,000 tons less same time last year. So when the trader tells you, yeah, African demand's not been that good, actually it hasn't. That's including the Chinese stuff that's going in. So there's not real replacement, but it's softening.
Well, just to add what Subra said too, you can just see these trends. But I would like to say this to all of you. I mean, it may seem that Subra is just a pretty face, but let me tell you, Subra's ability with the data and also the rice traders data set, I would say it's the best in the world anywhere I've seen. There's a lot of people who come up in speeches and talks, and they give a good speech. Subra and I will spend hours debating the finer points, only to realize we were probably saying the same thing after we've looked at data. So this is a very important thing. When we look at this, I know Subra could be up here for 4 to 5 hours, and we could talk about the finer points. But every point that Mr. Subra and myself make, it is based upon hours of painstaking data and our overall data set, which I still believe is the best in the world, which you can just see from this almost blinding number of data points on this page. These thoughts that Subra have are very well thought out and backed by data.
So the blue numbers below, they're actually from what we have from the big 5. Sadly, our Myanmar delegates, we're going to have to find a way to add your data in, but we're not getting very good, accurate data at the moment from Myanmar. But when we do, we should add them in. But what we show is that from India, Thailand, Vietnam, Pakistan and the US, exports are down, with only Pakistan showing a higher export, rather small increase year on year. This is based on what we see being lifted from key export origins for the same period. So it's not going to match what you have on top, but often we want to try and find a link between the two in terms of who's exporting more where. So in this particular case, you have almost all origins down except for Pakistan. And Pakistan's actually found a larger volume going to Africa this year than they did same time last year. A lot of Pakistan's improvements this year come both from non-basmati and basmati, and Africa is one part of it, Europe is the other part of it on the basmati story. Okay, now, so I got to work two charts. This is what I wanted to show you from the USDA. The imports, there's a gray line right below, is showing 15.57 and 16.78 million tons. And this comes from the USDA numbers. I don't have a say in how they put it together, but I imagine that it's based on the fact that, the orange line on top, it's consumption. It's very different from the global consumption numbers I showed you, right? So the orange number is showing you consumption in Africa that's rising at a fairly impressive rate. The yellow line is kind of curving downwards, and that's where the story is. I think a lot of people are afraid that weakening inventory would give the signal that you need to buy more in the future. That's a signal that I see from just statistics. Okay, what we hear on the floor is obviously very different from what our trader friends said. Then I went and took a little, actually I got to thank Jeremy. He said I need charts looking way back. So I got a longer term chart from the 1970s, and I realized that there are three peaks. But I think more interestingly, I find that the ability for Africa to draw down on its stocks when the prices are high is one that cannot be underestimated. So the thing is that the weakness that you're seeing today, Africa can still import less and not starve. You start cutting down the inventory numbers, and when the market is better, maybe the volumes will start rising back again, like they do on most any year. So you have an inventory number that's going like that, but it's still following the general trend of the consumption growth, which is a straighter line. I wanted to say, we talked about Africa, that's a commercial market. Now let's look at Asia. We've been telling you about how wonderful it's been from Asia demand, and that's exactly it. We actually saw 2.3 million tons more trade year on year between January and July than we did same time last year. That's almost 40% increase year on year. And it's no surprise. Bangladesh is high, but it's already slowed down. Okay? After May, I think the shipments to Bangladesh are much smaller. And then if you look at China, it's 5% weaker. Exactly what we talked about. The demand is slowing from China. And they've had 2 or 3 record years since 2011 towards the end of the year. China's been buying more and more and more as an importer, and it peaked over the last 2 years. And this year is the first time it's sort of topping off and coming down. Okay. Then when you look at Indonesia, I can tell you it's a 1,073% increase. But it really is when Bullock decided to come. I think I had the luxury of going back and looking at our reports from last year. We're happy to say we kind of expected it, and we put it down in our predictions last year. So let's see. But I don't expect Indonesia to stay as an importer for 2019. Why? Simply, any election year is very rare to see Indonesia take more imports in. They might do a contract now, but at the moment, as I understand, for a variety of domestic industry issues, not that Indonesia doesn't want to import more, but there are logistical concerns that are preventing it from happening in a bigger way now. Okay? I think there are ex-officials here who can definitely tell you a lot more. And then Malaysia also, I don't expect the trend to continue in that way. Malaysia looks like they covered themselves quite early in the year, but it was an election year for Malaysia too. So in that way, they were quite aggressively purchasing rice early in the year, but I feel by the end of the year, they are going to be a very consistent buyer. And Malaysia tends to buy every month. It's just that when the deal is good, they buy more, and when it's not so good, they buy less. And then there's also a specialty rice side to it, which I will explain to you later. Again, the blue numbers below show us, on destination we are 38%, but from origin it's 29%. to show you that from the exporters, everyone is up except the US. The US sold less to Asia. And a lot of that is a reflection of the US sales to Japan, Korea. Those are the key markets for the US. US doesn't get involved too much in the other Asian markets that we get excited over. So, Jeremy gets excited over Japonica. I'm kind of like a long grain guy. Okay, that's the African chart. Sorry, I was looking at it on my screen, but it wasn't updated there. The inventory one, the yellow chart with the 3 peaks, is what I was talking about. It's coming down now, but we've seen some years where it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years from 2008 or 2006, 2007 when it last happened. For 6 years, they could let the inventory come down and let the supply-demand difference be maintained. Okay. Again, this is the Asian chart that I wanted to that I was talking about, but you didn't see. So this shows you like a 38% increase from destinations that we monitor. These are the markets that we monitor. It's not everything like the USDA does a lot more, but we kind of monitor some markets that like 2 of us can still manage the statistics. We don't have a big army of statisticians to feed us more information, but we make do with what we get and try to give you an idea of what's going on. So it's very clear to see the only market that didn't sell more to Asia was the US on the blue charts below. China imports. This is an interesting one, only because you see forget the bar chart. The bar chart basically tells you which are the key origins, right? So the key origins would be Vietnam, Myanmar, Thailand, there's a bit of Cambodia, there's Pakistan, and India is not really present in this market. You can see, the dark blue at the bottom is Vietnam, the red is Thailand, the green is Pakistan, the purple is Myanmar, and then there's also a Laos element that we put in, but sometimes the Laos trade is quite interesting because a lot of it is Thai rice going through Laos to China. So we do tend to follow that, but that information, I'm lucky that the people in Thailand share that with us, so we have some insight to what's happening. But interestingly, okay, it's right there. Okay. This is where we are. This is where we are as of August. Right? That's January, August. Total exports. That's January, August here. Okay, and if I take the average, I'm not doing any special calculation. If I just take the average and apply it for the rest of the year, you're going to end 2018 here, whereas all the previous years you're ending closer to 5 million tons. So that's one of the weakness in demand that you're showing from China. Okay, there's the same information except I annualized it. So, and I didn't put it for you in bar charts and stuff like that. So it's the basic same thing. It shows you that the Chinese exports, if it goes at the current pace, up to August or September, you're going to be at about 3.5 million tons compared to 5.145. The red ones are what we compare, TRT. The green ones are what USDA puts in their reports. The blue ones are actually just old data. Okay, we have to go to the Philippines. Very big tender next week. But the Philippines has been a very impressive market. But what we notice is that the thought of importing rice from the Philippines, it's also gone through a structural change. The NFA's role seems to be strategically trying to maintain a buffer. Unfortunately, this year, at the beginning of the year, the NFA stocks were especially low, and this triggered a big move that not only saw NFA buy more rice, there was more minimum access volumes, imports allowed. There was an extension recently to address food inflation in Philippines, and I think this is going to continue. Now, one of the things that we're seeing, that next week's tender is going to be very important because it comes with a budget of 430. I think that if Philippines wants to buy all that 250,000 tons, you probably need to increase the budget. I personally feel so. And the prices are not very workable for Thai or Vietnam, but market watchers are also saying, hey, how about Myanmar or Pakistan or India? Can they make it into these tenders? Probably not all 250,000 tons, so we're kind of looking for the details in next week's tender to drive us forward. Now, what we showed you here is basically all the different origins that have been supporting the Philippines. And basically, you can see that Vietnam has been a very important part. And more recently, ever since the old crop, or rather ever since 2014, with the new government in Thailand, Thailand's also been more present in Vietnamese markets. So it's a combination of MAV or private imports versus NFA. NFA tends to buy white rice 25%, although now we're hearing in the news about whether the Philippines wants everyone to only import cheap rice or the lower grade rice and no fancy rice as they show in the newspapers. This is all very much work in progress. Oftentimes we hear very conflicting news day to day from the Philippines. You know, if a friend sends you one link, you can send him another link that is telling you the exact opposite, but quoting a different person from the Senate or somewhere else. So it's a very politically motivated market. They are still talking about the idea of tariffication, which is going to be facing some resistance, I believe, from the farmer groups. But it's going to be very interesting. I feel that already in the last 3 years, the Philippines has actually opened up more of a role for the private sector. I can also slightly tell you that that's one of the reasons why we're looking at the next conference to possibly be in the Philippines, because we see it as an active market going through changes that's going to deliver fresh opportunities to anyone in the rice trade. Okay, I wanted to quickly say one thing instead of Malaysia. The Philippines, do you think they need or can get delivery of 750,000 tons by the end of the year? I think that's going to be a very important question. And I think this is where the government, Mr. Rex, would have a better insight to tell us just how. And I think nobody's in a position to say we're going to do it or not going to do it. It all depends on how the process of buying that first 250,000 tons is going to lead us forward. So I think there's a plan too. I feel that it's unlikely to be all in 2018. It's probably going to spill over into the next year and as the government tries to make sense of what they need and when they need it. Malaysia, this was one of the strong markets, and I intentionally left the trend here. That means, you know, if you do January, July imports and you stretch it throughout the year, you're going to get a record import. That's why I feel that Q3 and Q4 imports are actually slightly less. You're going to end up with a number that's closer to around there somewhere, you know, at the end of the year. But you can see it's dominated by Vietnam. We have a prominent Thai presence there. Pakistan is also growing this year. Maybe it's shrunk over the last few years. And there's quite a regular Indian rice import that tends to go to the Indian community in Malaysia. That includes me. So. I want to look at Indonesia. Okay, this is what we have for Indonesia. And we could take this chart and I always tell my friends that we should draw lines to which are the election years and stuff like that. And actually we have one of the former chiefs of Bulog here, who I always used to go and visit in his office to have discussions about when we're, and he has to keep the information close to his chest then. But now we can talk with hindsight. So this is for Indonesia, and this is one of the big reasons why we've seen imports really. This is already shipped 1.7 million tons. And our idea about Indonesia is that there's normally about 300 to 400,000 tons of commercial rice. That's your broken and glutinous rice that goes to private and noodle factories and stuff like that. And then there's the Bulog element that comes when needed. Typically, they are also maintaining a buffer stock, and at the moment, Bulog stocks are back up. And if anyone remembers Pak Tato's chart last year from Macau, he showed us that Bulog purchases and their own stocks were not as healthy as one would like. So like the Philippines, at the start of this year, Bulog was under the harsh reality that there's an election year coming soon, and you might want to do something about making sure that you have the ability to import rice, and not only import rice, but use this rice to manage food inflation. We have seen the rice prices in domestic markets. They are around 10,300 rupiah per kilo right now. But they were up to 12,000 at the February or January, February of the year. So this was also similar to what happened in Philippines. And so you had two giant potential importers who don't normally come to the market at the same time, but they just happen to come to the market at the exact same time. Okay, now we want to look at the Middle East, also trending downwards. Both our data was showing India having a 5% increase, which was 141,000 ton more business, which I was telling you earlier on. This has helped. Whatever India lost in European markets to Pakistan, they gained it in the Middle East. So Thailand shipped less. You can say that most of this was last year. They had the Iran deals, Iran tender, home Mali sales through tender last year, which didn't quite happen this year. There's some talk and there's some demand, but we're not going to see that kind of volumes this year. So you're going to probably stay closer to that kind of negative level. Pakistan is weaker, and the US has been weaker. US, one of the big markets for the US is like Saudi Arabia, and I think in the case of US, they might do a swift turnaround this year because of the way Iraq has been handling them with special deals. The most recent was $625 a ton for 90,000 tons of US rice in the tender, I think, last week. Okay, so that's going to add to it. So that's how we look at the Middle East. And the Middle East, the key markets are really, we follow a few of them. Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Yemen. And each one has a different characteristic. Iran has a tendency to be a largely a strong basmati rice demand market. Saudi Arabia is quite similar. It also has a strong basmati demand. Iraq has been largely tender-based. There's some private sales from India that also make it there, but the real big suppliers to Iraq in the last 2 years would be Vietnam, as we've seen. Even the Iraqi gentleman, Mr. Haitham, has told us that 300,000 tons already been bought, which is more than what they bought last year from Vietnam. And then similarly, the tender business has gone mainly to South America. And then after every tender, there's normally a bit of US business conducted as well. So that's made the Iraq business interesting. And Turkey is also quite interesting in the sense that when I first met Jeremy in TRT, Turkey used to be considered a US Calrose, Japonica market. It's still there, but Turkey's become different. It's become a supplier to Syria and Iran and other parts through the road trade. So you're seeing more Indian rice, you're seeing other grades of rice show up, and these a lot of it is for transshipment into inland markets. So you might say that a market like Turkey, the UAE, and Oman have the ability to not just receive cargo but redistribute them to inland markets. So I want to show you Iran. Okay, you can see that last year you saw some other. That's Thailand there, and that's South America there, and that's India. This year is almost exclusively India. You know, that's been the difference, and this is a market that we're going to see the sanctions leave its own impact. They're going to need some kind of imports. So the question is, how is this going to take place? And that's going to give you the details as we go along. I don't have the answers. This is Iraq, and very close to what I just said. That's the US. In red is South America. In purple is Vietnam. And in blue is India. India used to win, I think 2 years back, the last tender success saw India have both private sales as well as tender success. But now India is mainly private sales every month to Iraq. But in terms of the official purchases by the government or the GBI, they tended to favor the bottom three, as in the US, South America. South America is mostly Uruguay and Argentina, and more recently one shipment of Paraguay. So we've been following that.
You know, just to add to Subra's point too, you know, this Iraqi trade, like most of our markets, there is the normal economic fundamental market, and then there's the political trade. And there's so much Subra and I often not speak of that happens in the world rice market because it's very private. You know, what's happened in Iraq is a very odd thing when they're buying lower quality, much higher price from the U.S. Now that's just an example. But you also see the same exact thing in Latin America, and their customers are complaining daily about how bad the quality is in the U.S. And you know, this is all, demand changes over time. There's always a delay effect in demand. Watch. But stuff like this, on one dime, like Subra made a very good point on, the U.S. can start doing these large trades. It doesn't make economic sense, but it makes political sense, which in a way actually makes sense, right?
Yeah. There's a political aspect to it, no doubt. And as well as Mr. Haitham has told us that rice production in the area was never huge, but it's coming down. Even that little bit is coming down. So there's a whole water issue. And on the positive, you have an improving oil price, probably supporting the Middle East, the mood there. Because I would imagine that a few years ago, people were worried that below $50 oil price would mean trouble for the Middle East. And we'll show you that the Middle East actually didn't buy that much during the low oil price days. And so right now, let's go and see whether they can do the better in the year ahead. This is Saudi Arabia also weakening, but it's a huge market. It's not seeing the peak ever since oil prices came down. So this is one very good example of a market that tends to slow down. Turkey, again, I wanted to show you the vast number of origins that are supporting Turkey. Really, previously, this is before all the road trade came about. And suddenly you have Syria, Iran, various other cross-border trades from Turkey. And you also have a smaller presence from the US. The US was nearly 50% of markets in 2010. Today it's hardly featuring, and obviously there are some political elements at play today. But the Turkish market represents on one part a Japonica market that the locals consume, and on the second part, so the key markets that are supplying the Japonica would be US, China, well, I'm not going to say Egypt to some degree, but not anymore. And you have the FSU, the Russia, Ukraine, and those markets also quite active in those markets. Whereas anything from South Asia, from Asia, broader Asia, not China, tends to be a long grain, which I understand is not really being consumed by the Turkish population themselves, but goes to the neighboring countries. This is for Yemen. We have a delegate from Yemen here, so he will tell you that they've been very aggressive. And I'm going to point out the fact that I don't think this is going to happen. Although they've been very aggressively buying this year more than previous years. So basically what I do is, like, if I have your numbers up to July, August, I divide it by 8, and then I use that average for the rest of it. Well, this is not a very smart thing to do, but we have seen Yemen imports be very erratic. When they buy a lot. A lot of it tends to reflect the shipping and the logistics constraints that we face. Okay, I thought that's the end of the little country by country look. Let's look at prices. This one goes way back, and I should really read the words there, but I can't see them now. Okay, I mean, I think it's not a surprise. It's been rising of late. And in terms of the highlights for the year, we have seen Asian prices rising since December 2017. Well, I've said this too many times. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and then Southeast Asian demand elements have been very strong for most of the year, but they've started fading now. And a lot of people were, when I met people in May and June, and I talked to them about markets, they were telling me that, once the Bulog and the NFA stuff is done, you're going to see Africa come back to the market, and it hasn't quite happened. I mean, the African demand is always there, but as I showed you, it's slightly softer than usual. And this is partly, you can look at the Chinese presence there, but also the weaker euro, the fact that you have inventory that was priced at a higher price than what is being made available today. So there's a bit of dispute, a battle going on there. And what we're basically seeing is like that Asian demand has given way. But the thing is that looking ahead, the big elephant in the room is the Philippines. Whatever they do is going to affect at least Vietnam and Thailand, either positively or negatively. And what I feel is that if Vietnam and Thailand get dragged into supplying the Philippines, then it's probably going to leave the African door open for other origins, Myanmar, India, and Pakistan particularly. And because as we see it already, the prices are very competitive. I know there have been there's been quite a bit of demand for Indian rice. Pakistan's not taken off as much as they did same time last year, so it's going to be a wait and see game. But the more Vietnam and Thailand focus on the Philippines and their prices rise, it makes India, Pakistan, and even Myanmar that much more attractive. This is something I wanted to show you in terms of, I made this chart to show you when the old crop was coming in, that the prices are slowly inching. The lowest low during any season is getting higher, and the highest high is also getting higher. So I think there's a general trend. But my issue is, that's Vietnam up there, and that's Thailand, and then that's India down there. So it's quite clear to me that you're already seeing that interest in the Philippines have a positive impact. Thailand, as Ravi Sak mentioned earlier on, has also not been affected by the strong dollar because the Thai baht's been even stronger, because of its positive economy. I'm not going to give you outlook yet, because I feel that the outlook at this point would depend on what happens the next month. I feel short term it's going to be bullish. But at the same time, if I'm going to be an Africa buyer, I would be looking at India and Pakistan for my supplies, because basically the price just makes sense compared to Thai. Myanmar is another market. A lot of traders a month ago were telling me that Myanmar needs to lower its prices, the IMATA 25% to closer to 305 or 310 if they are going to make it to compete with the Chinese whole stock. But the thing is that with the developments in Philippines, even if Myanmar is able to take some opportunity from the Philippines standard, it might open the door for an interesting shift in the future. The problem is, once the Philippines comes and goes, what do we have left for 2019? That's where I feel that with the elections in Indonesia, elections in India, you might find that India, I'm very interested to see how this rupee and the domestic politics balancing acts, the purchases by the government, any bonuses they give to the farmers, it all depends on, someone who was kind enough to say that it will depend on which state you're from, whether you're from the ruling government or you're from the opposition, the benefits can flow or not flow to you. So the competitive environment tells you exactly the same thing. The premium for Vietnam and Thailand is on the rise, and that means the South Asia and Myanmar are actually looking more attractive. Now, this is an interesting one since home mali prices really shot up over the late last year up to now. It's come down a bit. Ignore this number, it's a bit of an aggregate that we use at TRT that includes home mali and Patum Thani rice. But if you look at that, that's the wholesale price for home mali, and it's started rebounding after peaking recently, and some people were trying to give discounts to test the market. But if I tell you that there are enough offers today in the market for a new crop home mali, which is much cheaper than the prices I put here. So the thing is that you're in a position where the market's going to change. Normally in Thailand, you see two prices from now until a few months, one for the old crop and one for the new crop. And with the assumption that the supply is going to be normalized again, one would assume that there's going to be some price discussions. So most of the delegates who I've spoken to at coffee, they seem to be quite comfortable with Thai home mali prices at around 900. No one can really guarantee that, but I reckon that the weakness will persist until November, December, and by January, prices should start stabilizing, if not rising back up. We saw a couple of years back where the Thai prices went down to nearly $500 a ton for home mali. Can you imagine what that did to the Vietnamese competition? They were quite worried about that. But as long as that $900, $800 premium is there, I think there's enough room for everyone to coexist. Our friends from Cambodia may have to adjust their prices downward. They tend to price off Thailand. And that's what we kind of see. It really all depends now on the Thai crop. The Thai crop being normalized will allow us markets to settle down after the sort of shortages of last year. Now this is more white and fragrant brokens. Now basically, one of the things we wanted to focus here was how Indian prices didn't really fall like they normally do last year. because there was a strong parboiled rice demand, and the kind of milling requirements and the kind of availability for broken rice was affected then. So I remember last year very clearly, because just before the conference was probably the last time that Indian prices were below 300. And then after that it was just up all the way. And that opened the door to even Brazil and other origins. And one of the other elements in broken rice that's been rising is Chinese demand. There's good reason why China has left the door open for broken rice at 5% duty and no real need for allocation papers. There is an industrial demand, there is a demand for this type of rice coming from there. And that demand, I remember going to Thailand, and fairly high prices for China were being accepted at the time. So there's an ability to accept the price if you have a need for it. And I think that Chinese demand and the African demand will have to fight it out. At the moment, I think the Chinese demand is going mainly to Myanmar, to Thailand, and Vietnam's really not selling as much. For some reason, Vietnam was selling a few 100,000 tons 2 years back, but this year it was quite negligible, maybe like 20,000 tons for the whole year so far. So that's something that we keep looking at. There's a Chinese demand element and there's an African demand element. And as far as the fragrant, the one up there, that's fragrant broken sand. We tend to use Thai prices because I give you an example. At the peak, Thailand was exporting nearly 900,000 tons of fragrant brokens, and it was at a much cheaper price. But today, at the higher price and the lower production supporting the higher prices, the prices have increased significantly, but so have the volumes have also come down. So a normalization of the crop is going to help Thailand come back to a more competitive price, which one would assume a more competitive price would be around this level. And it's interesting also, just going back to brokens, what's also interesting is that's India. It's almost all of it's generated by a weak rupee. And typically around this time, you tend to find Myanmar quite competitive for brokens, but this year India is really taking the cake. And on top of having such an attractive price, they're able to supply a significant volume. India does some amazing broken rice sales when the appetite is there. Basmati rice, I'm not going to dwell in it too much. Lower production we're seeing. Prices have been there because Iran has been quite good so far, but I think there are a lot of question marks ahead. The question marks are the food safety rules in Europe, and more recently some people are showing that Saudi Arabia is considering some limits on residue. There's always a heavy metal issue that affects some of the Middle East trade, but I feel that Pakistan's production is rising, India's production is actually falling, and a lot of the trend is going to be on whether India is able to reclaim that Iran demand, and that post-November sanctions period, what will happen is going to be quite important. We had Protic just come back from an Iran tender. No deals yet, but there's some incredibly cheap prices being thrown out. So just to give you that someone's prepared to bet on that, that the Iran element or demand element is not going to be as strong for the upcoming season as others. No? Free. Thank you, Protik. Yeah, Protik did say you might as well give it away free. Parboiled rice, I think it's been one of the softer markets ever since Bangladesh left. Last year was interesting. We had Bangladesh being a big buyer. We had Sri Lanka also buying quite a bit of parboiled rice, and we had a Nigeria-related import, which was quite reasonable or stronger than usual, which many people got excited because this year with the higher oil prices backing Nigeria, a lot of people expected Nigerian trades to be much stronger from August until November. But this hasn't quite been the case, although we're not quite November yet. But the market is heavily dependent on Nigeria for the higher quality. And then you have Thailand and India really providing the key supplies, while every now and then you have Brazil, which can really be dictated by its own supply and availability. The low grade scenario I mentioned, it's pointing upwards. My problem is like, I actually think that this is a bit of a concern. And of course, we have the Philippines in the market. So in the short term, you might find the prices are being lifted if Philippines buys that 750,000 tons. The question is really, when do they buy, what price, and when will it all be delivered? So really, it's in the details. And I personally feel that they are not going to buy 750,000 tons to be shipped by the end of this year, whereas it's going to be spread out over a longer period, which might allow for maybe not $430 CIF price, but maybe something closer to 450, 460. I don't know. That's just my guess. So it's like a coffee table guess. But what you are seeing here is, again, India and Myanmar. These are markets. So if you don't have access to NFA, that attractiveness will lend itself to Africa and other buyers. So the thing is that one of the theories that I've been thinking about is like earlier this year, when the whole market was crazy about Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines, it actually opened the door for India and even to some degree Pakistan to improve their volumes and sales to Africa, because they didn't have direct access to some of these markets. Pakistan won 200,000 tons, as did India for Indonesia. And there were some shipments from India and Pakistan to Philippines, but nowhere to the scale of what we saw from Thailand and Vietnam. China exports. Unfortunately, this is the best I could do. I'll tell you the reason why. I feel that the Chinese exported close to 800,000 tons to Africa last year, for the whole year, about 800,000 tons. And for this year, unfortunately, our data source has stopped updating since March. So we're going to give you some very informal data to say that we feel that Chinese rice in Africa probably accounts for 1.2 to 1.4 million tons this year. That's almost doubling from last year. But at the same time, when you think about it, when you had Thai old crop, I think you're talking about 2.5, 3 million tons of Thai old crop per year. So China is not completely replacing it. So what's happening? If it's not a full replacement or substitution, then we have to start looking elsewhere. So my theory there again is that you're going to see India, Pakistan, and even Myanmar, especially India and Myanmar, compete quite fiercely for that African business, that especially when other markets are concerned with others. So China has been important. It's a bit of a guessing game in the dark. You make up numbers until the official numbers start coming back. And Mr. Lee, you might be able to help me shed some light there. But we will talk about that every now and then. Okay, now this is an old slide I show you just to tell you that it's not just white rice, parboiled rice, or japonica rice. This is just a very broad estimate. But I try to update it every now and then, and I think it's relatively okay. Probably the fragrant brokens is a bit lower because of the situation today. Glutinous will probably be a little bit lower. Parboiled rice is probably quite spot on, or maybe a slightly lower if you take Bangladesh out of the picture. But generally, it gives you an idea that out of 44 million tons of world trade, that's a USDA number, or 44 or 45, about half, or even slightly more than half, is not just white rice. It's quite specialty rice. So when you look at that, and you look at when we're here in Vietnam, you've seen in 2011 when we had the conference in Ho Chi Minh City, there were more African delegates. There were more interest from Vietnam to sell to Africa at that time. 2011, at that time, they were only starting to hear the Chinese demand coming. It was just the beginning. That was the first time that the Chinese buyers started to show more prominently. And funny thing is that it started in Pakistan. In 2011, sort of October, November, suddenly there was some interest from China, and next thing you know, it's become a regular interest that's lasted all these years. So the thing is that that's something that we're constantly looking at. In terms of the market, so we feel that the white rice market tends to be built, the bullishness and the bearishness tends to be built on your ability to surprise. So 2 years ago, the surprise was Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. They added a lot of new demand to the market, so that tipped the favor to a more bullish picture. And then last year was quite bullish because Thai old crop was getting more expensive, and we had Indonesia, Philippines, and everyone else come back. So it's been quite bullish in that way. My question now is, looking ahead, it's very nice to it's very nice to sort of like say predict a very bullish picture, nice charts. But I guess I get the feeling that in 2019 we don't have a really big Indonesian element. It's unlikely because it's election year and you have to be very careful during election year. And at the moment they seem to have reined in a domestic price and they seem to be armed with enough stocks to make sure that domestic price will be under some control. So barring a weather incident and with Indonesia, have you seen the number of earthquakes they've had and tsunami and everything else? So there's always some room for surprises there. But for the time being, as far as we can see, they don't need to buy more. Although I would say that it still makes sense if they can get it. Excuse me. China has been a weak point. The question now is like, how long is China going to maintain this new policy stance? Because I think as long as they maintain this policy stance, you're going to see rice imports maybe 3.5, 4 million tons instead of the 5 and 6 that we talk about that tells you about how wonderful China is as the world's largest importer. The other question to us is like markets like Southeast Asia as a whole, apart from the Philippines. Malaysia is going to be normal. As far as we are concerned, Malaysia has been buying every month without fail, and they do their own tinkering in terms of what grades is required based on demand that comes from their Bernas representing consumer demand in Malaysia. So they've done a very good job and they buy all year round. And when the opportunities are good, they'll buy more. And most recently, we've seen Bernas also buy some Myanmar rice. So that's been quite interesting because I think in one deal, they bought more rice than they did from Myanmar in quite a few years. So it's becoming quite interesting. I think buyers are also opening up to the fact that there are options available. And I feel that the mood for 2019 is a little less clear because of this situation we're in. Now, key concerns looking ahead. The earlier slide was telling you more or less the highlights of this year. So, the global economic conditions, the dollar is strong, rising oil prices. I can say that over and over again. You could do that in CNN as well. But what I feel is that all these events have led to a more cautious environment and people to pause and see, okay, is this situation going to last, and how long is it going to last? Because if I'm going to make a decision, a trading decision today, and this situation changes 3 or 4 months' time, then the trading decision could be wrong. So I think it's lent to a more hand-to-mouth kind of feel to markets. So you're hearing more from origins in Thailand, in India. Well, India right now, they seem to be quite happy in the sense that more orders seem to be landing with them. But in Pakistan and Thailand especially, and Vietnam, I think there's a bit of caution from the buyers. And that caution is showing in terms of the lower volumes, or there's a concern that the forward order book is not as full as it once was. And it comes at a time when there's more supply arriving to the market. So I feel there's a bearish element. The only good news is that with the Philippines there to buy, you may not need to collapse the market to let it come up again. I think with Philippines there, if Thailand and Vietnam end up supplying the Philippines, then India, Pakistan, Myanmar, whoever is left, will have a more competitive price relative to Thailand or Vietnam, and be able to supply other markets that would have demand. And we feel that because of the lack of a star buyer in 2019, I mean, probably the closest thing we have is Philippines. But unlike this year where we had Philippines, Malaysia and Indonesia, or the year before with Bangladesh coming in a very big way, we don't have that star buyer right now. So the thing is that I feel that African trade could be quite important. But a lot of it can only be established once we have a more calm or a steady, whatever is happening with the volatility, prices, dollar, it needs to be more certain before you can do something. Last year, same time, almost every trader was actually quite happy because the euro was getting stronger, the positions in Africa looked very good, and it was quite easy to make money that way. Whereas this year, it's been a little bit more choppy in terms of buyer response to what you have. And if your origin is competitive, you're obviously going to get the interest of the buyer, whatever little or more there is. I don't think the demand is dead. It's just adjusting to the current market that just goes beyond the rice supply and demand, but also in terms of how you plan the next 6 months in a market that has had so much of political effects in place. So really, I want to say thank you. I come to the end, and you can always ask us questions, and I say that this in every time. Rice market is actually quite easy to understand once you understand weather and politics. So the thing is that those are the two biggest unknown. We are waiting for information on Thailand crop, the Indian crop, Myanmar crop, everything is in progress right now. And on the buying side, there's a lot of elections coming up. We have Indian elections, Indonesian elections, Nigeria elections, Philippines has elections, Bangladesh has elections. China is making its own new policies based on this whole new trade dynamics. China is making new friends out there, while the US is making it difficult in other ways. So I think that's going to be, it leaves you with a bit, I'm going to leave you with a bit of grey clouds with uncertainty. I was trying to tell someone that I'm looking for a silver lining. The only silver lining I could find was the possibility that Philippines would be continuing to show some interest in markets. But overall, I feel that the supply part of it is getting a bit overwhelming without a star buyer in the market. All right, thank you very much. Woo.